all of that internalized persona, all of that shame that society places needs to be stripped away for the raw sexuality to emerge.
Our question today comes from Sage, a 23-year-old woman who writes that she's been watching porn from a young age and has always felt turned on by male dominance. Over time, she's continued to enjoy escalating degrees of degradation, both verbal and physical, in the bedroom. She describes acts like slapping, choking, being called names, and being made to put on a dog leash. She asks if this is a sign of her disrespecting herself because she often has guilty feelings about these acts when she does them with a partner.
So this is something you and I have talked about, this notion of overly internalizing the persona and the notion that society's judgment, that the judgment of her parents, for instance, is usually where this comes from in childhood at least, is the quote unquote right judgment, and that her internal desires are quote unquote wrong. And so the excessively strong and excessively internalized persona is reasserting itself when she comes out of the scene. She's enjoying this when she's turned on, and then when she comes out, then she judges what she's done or what she has enjoyed in retrospect once she has come back out of the shadow. And so what's challenging here is she's doing 90% of the work, but she just needs to integrate and say, look, the public judgment is not and has no place in private. It's not the right judgment. It's not more correct than the shadow. It's just what's appropriate in public. If this person were in front of me, I would actually challenge her with literally the 180 thought. I would actually say that this is her respecting herself by engaging and honoring her shadow and the totality of who she is and her being. And so far from disrespecting herself, this is in fact the highest form of respecting herself that she could engage in.
I think that's very well said. And coming from someone who got into kink later in life, I think your book, especially the first section where the archetypes are described, and then there's a connection made between how kink is really just an embodiment of these archetypes and it's a form of shadow work. I think it gave me the intellectual groundwork for being able to divorce from any sense of shame. This is perhaps a very common question. Like you're grown up to have these expectations of certain kinds of appropriate behavior, what is appropriate, what is not, and then you do all this kink stuff, which is the opposite of the persona, the appropriate behavior you've been taught. And then you don't really have any kind of an intellectual framework. Some people don't need that framework. Some people just say, well, this is who I am and screw it. I don't care what you think. This is what I like to do. But I needed the framework. I needed an understanding of why this is acceptable behavior. Your book, like I said, especially the first volume, did a lot of work for me to embrace it fully. And once I got it straight in my head, just went full steam ahead. I'm like, oh, this totally makes sense. So the phenomena of feeling shame in kink is perhaps just a reflection that you don't really understand why it is that this is okay.
Sure.
It's not just like, oh, I'm okay and you're okay and you should accept yourself for who you are, blah, blah, blah. That kind of flowery, wishy-washy, everything is valid, postmodernist kind of thinking it has dangerous offshoots and ramifications in other arenas. But this is not that. This is a good philosophical underpinning for why it is. There's nothing to be ashamed about when you're practicing safe, consensual, kinky play with another partner, as long as you understand that you're doing shadow work. If she has a degradation kink or she has a CNC kink or whatever kink she has, as long as it is being done with a consensual partner in a healthy way, there is absolutely nothing to be ashamed about. That you're doing shadow work. Just like you said, she's honoring herself by being her full, authentic self.
I think that's well said. And I'm always glad to hear the book is helpful. That's why I wrote it. It is deep and it is complicated and it's a bit to churn through. But the reason is because I'm trying to transmit a pretty complex philosophical viewpoint where a lot of these things are just intuited or they're experienced, but I'm trying to actually articulate it, which just requires a lot of complexity. The other thing I would say is that without that complexity, we may make other areas to say, oh, maybe society shouldn't shame this. And it's like, no, that's also wrong. Society should shame this because we need to work together in certain ways. We need society to function in certain ways. So, for instance, one of the examples I give in the book is the notion of slut shaming. One of the core sexual ideas of humanity is that the men compete amongst themselves and with the environment, and then women select based on their preferences and based on the success of the men in that competition. If you make sex easy to obtain, you undercut that whole system. And so for a sexual selection mechanism to function in society, we need women to maintain a certain degree of difficulty in obtaining sex. Undercutting that will inevitably trigger a societal shame. In an intimate relationship, that is flipped on its head, is that all of that internalized persona, all of that shame that society places needs to be stripped away for the raw sexuality that has been suppressed and put into the shadow to emerge. And that's the role of intimacy. That's the role of a private relationship. That's the role of this other context where you can truly reclaim those parts of yourself that were sent off into the shadows in order to participate in society. The notion of venturing in, and then she says she feels guilty about this after. I think there is this notion that we make journeys into the shadow and then we return. And that's how we integrate. One of my favorite quotes from Ursula K. Le Guin is, "An explorer who will not come back to tell his tale is not an explorer, only an adventurer, and his sons are born in exile." And I think taking that metaphor somewhat loosely here is when you come back, you have to integrate it. You can't just go out into the shadow, have an adventure, and then come back and feel guilty and reassert the persona unchanged and say, oh no, I feel guilty, I feel bad because I'm a terrible person because of all. You're not integrating the shadow then, you're still rejecting it. You haven't done any of the shadow work, or you've done 90% and then failed at the finish line in some sense. Is that last bit is that when you return, make some effort to say, that's really me, and that's okay. That's in private with an intimate partner with whom I'm safe. It's good to be seen as my full self. And that is honoring the reality, the truth of my soul is being honored and respected here, no matter how dirty that may be in the eyes of society.